Throughout history, the greatest threats to civilization have never come from natural disasters or external enemies, but from within, from the collective descent into madness. Entire societies have crumbled, not because of war or famine alone, but because fear was weaponized, truth was silenced, and reason was replaced with blind obedience. The terrifying reality is that mass psychosis does not announce itself. It creeps in quietly, like a fog rolling over the mind of a people, distorting their perception of reality until they can no longer tell truth from deception, freedom from servitude. What if I told you that the most dangerous epidemic isn't of the body, but of the mind? That entire populations can be hypnotized into accepting oppression, even celebrating it? That through propaganda, censorship, and psychological manipulation, people can be made to turn against their own best interests, to not only tolerate control, but to demand it. History is filled with these moments, periods where rational men and women became complicit in atrocities, where entire nations succumbed to delusions that justified the unthinkable, and yet we tell ourselves it could never happen again. But what if it already is? What if the signs are all around us, and we simply refuse to see? Because once a society crosses the threshold of delusion, once fear takes hold and critical thinking is abandoned, there is no limit to the horrors it will justify. The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduced them. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. Gustave Le Bon, The Crowd. A study of the popular mind diseases of the body can spread through a population and reach epidemic proportions, but so too can diseases of the mind. And of these epidemics of the latter variety, the mass psychosis is the most dangerous. During a mass psychosis, madness becomes the norm in a society, and delusional beliefs spread like a contagion. But as delusions can take many forms, and as madness can manifest in countless ways, the specific manner in which a mass psychosis unfolds will differ based on the historical and cultural context of the infected society. Modern technology was once seen as a tool for liberation, an instrument that would grant individuals more access to knowledge, freedom of expression, and the power to shape their own reality. But in an ironic twist, it has become the very mechanism that makes mass psychosis not only possible, but inevitable. The rise of the digital world has not expanded human thought, it has condensed it, trapping people in ideological echo chambers where alternative perspectives are drowned out by algorithmic reinforcement. Instead of cultivating wisdom, technology now cultivates obedience. Instead of fostering deep reflection, it fuels impulsive reactions. The internet was meant to connect us, yet it has made us more isolated than ever. Social media, which promised to bring people together, has become a battleground for tribalism, outrage, and groupthink. The constant bombardment of information does not enlighten, it overwhelms. The human mind, no longer given time to process and reflect, becomes desperate for simplicity, for clear-cut narratives, for an authority to tell it what is true and what is false. And when fear is introduced into this landscape, be it through manufactured crises, sensationalist news, or algorithmically amplified hysteria, entire populations can be nudged toward conformity, toward blind obedience, toward mass delusion. Consider the way information is now consumed. The traditional slow, deliberate process of reading, contemplating, and debating has been replaced by the rapid, reactionary consumption of short-form media. Attention spans have collapsed. Deep thinking is discouraged. The ability to hold multiple perspectives at once, to entertain nuance, to challenge one's own beliefs, these qualities are being eroded in real time. The digital world rewards emotion over reason, speed over substance, spectacle over truth. And in a world where technology dictates perception, whoever controls the flow of information controls the minds of the masses. Even the mere presence of technology alters human psychology. The constant exposure to screens has rewired our brains, making individuals more dependent on external validation, more prone to anxiety, and more susceptible to manipulation. The addiction to digital stimulation creates a population that is always distracted, always seeking the next dopamine hit, always too engaged in the trivial to notice the profound. And in this state of fragmentation and dependency, the mind becomes more vulnerable to suggestion, more willing to accept the narratives fed to it without question. But perhaps the most insidious effect of modern technology is how it has turned surveillance into self-policing. People no longer need to be threatened into compliance. They do it willingly. They censor themselves. They report their peers. They enforce ideological purity, not because a gun is pointed at them, but because they have been conditioned to equate obedience with virtue. The fear of being ostracized, deplatformed, or digitally erased is enough to keep most people in line. The power structure doesn't need to impose tyranny from the top down when the masses will impose it on themselves. And so, technology has not only facilitated mass psychosis, it has optimized it. It has created an environment where deception spreads faster than truth, where independent thought is drowned out by collective hysteria, and where reality itself is dictated by algorithms designed not to inform, but to control. The digital age has not freed humanity. It has shackled it in ways more subtle, more pervasive, and more inescapable than any system of oppression that came before. Technology has become the tool for mass psychosis. Then breaking free requires something rare in the modern world: silence, solitude, and true reflection. But how many still possess the will to step away, to disconnect from the endless noise and reclaim the ability to think for themselves? A mind constantly bombarded with external input loses its ability to generate independent thought. The more we rely on algorithms to tell us what to think, what to fear, and even what to desire, the less we question, the less we resist, and the less we see the invisible cage forming around us. And a society that no longer thinks is a society sleepwalking into its own enslavement. The question is no longer whether technology is shaping us. It is whether we still have the strength to shape ourselves. Because the longer we wait, the deeper we sink. And at some point, we may look around and realize there is no longer a way out. Throughout history, we have seen entire civilizations succumb to this collective madness. In the Salem witch trials of 1692, paranoia gripped the Puritan community, leading to the execution of 20 innocent people. In Nazi Germany, a population that was once home to some of the greatest thinkers in history fell under the spell of an ideology that justified unspeakable horrors. And in Cambodia, under the Khmer Rouge, an entire nation was driven to self-destruction as intellectuals, artists, and even those who wore glasses were executed under the delusion that they were enemies of the people. In the modern era, it is the mass psychosis of totalitarianism that is the greatest threat. Totalitarianism is the modern phenomenon of total centralized state power coupled with the obliteration of individual human rights. In the totalized state, there are those in power, and there are the objectified masses, the victims. Arthur Versluys, The New Inquisitions. In a totalitarian society, the population is divided into two groups, the rulers and the ruled, and both undergo a pathological transformation. The rulers are elevated to an almost godlike status, diametrically opposed to human nature, which is flawed, fallible, and easily corrupted by power. In the 20th century alone, figures like Stalin, Mao, and Hitler became near deities in their respective nations, their images plastered on walls, their words treated as gospel. Meanwhile, the masses are reduced to obedient subjects, taking on a psychologically regressed and childlike state. This was observed by Hannah Arendt, one of the 20th century's preeminent scholars of totalitarianism, who described it as an attempted transformation of human nature itself. There is in fact much that is comparable between the strange reactions of the citizens of totalitarianism and their culture as a whole on the one hand, and the reactions of the sick schizophrenic on the other. Joost Meerloo, The Rape of the Mind. In every case, the transformation of a society into a totalitarian state is built upon and sustained by delusions, for only a population steeped in falsehoods and propaganda would willingly submit to such a system. Consider George Orwell's experience in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. While fighting against Franco's forces, Orwell saw firsthand how truth could be twisted beyond recognition. He noted that even newspapers that were supposed to be on the same side were fabricating entirely different versions of events. Orwell later warned in 1984 that when the state controls language, it can control thought itself. Only deluded men and women regress to the childlike status of submissive subjects, handing over complete control of their lives to politicians and bureaucrats. Only a deluded ruling class believes it possesses the wisdom to micromanage an entire society. And only a deluded populace believes that a world divided into power-hungry rulers and psychologically regressed citizens will lead to anything other than mass suffering and social ruin. The mechanisms of mass psychosis. What triggers the psychosis of totalitarianism? The mass psychosis of totalitarianism begins in the ruling class. Throughout history, politicians, bureaucrats, and those hungry for power have deluded themselves into believing they alone should control society. When a ruling elite becomes possessed by such an ideology, be it communism, fascism, or technocracy, the next step is to induce the population into accepting their rule by infecting them with the mass psychosis of totalitarianism. This psychosis has been induced many times throughout history, and as Joost Meerloo explains, it is simply a question of reorganizing and manipulating collective feelings in the proper way. Joost Meerloo, The Rape of the Mind. The general method by which the ruling class achieves this is called menticide, meaning the killing of the mind. Menticide is an old crime against the human mind and spirit, but systematized anew. It is an organized system of psychological intervention and judicial perversion through which a ruling class can imprint their own opportunistic thoughts upon the minds of those they plan to use and destroy. Joost Meerloo, The Rape of the Mind. The first step of menticide is sowing fear. Men fear thought as they fear nothing else on earth, more than ruin, more even than death. Thought is subversive and revolutionary, destructive and terrible. Thought is merciless to privilege, established institutions, and comfortable habit. Bertrand Russell, Why Men Fight Historically. Those who seek to manipulate the masses have always understood that fear makes people more obedient. From the reign of terror during the French Revolution to the McCarthy era of anti-communist hysteria in America, waves of terror have been used to keep populations emotionally exhausted and psychologically pliable. Once fear takes hold, propaganda is used to spread confusion. When contradictory reports, nonsensical narratives, and blatant lies flood the media, people lose their ability to discern truth from fiction. Logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot. It confuses those who think straight. The big lie and monotonously repeated nonsense have more emotional appeal than logic and reason. Joost Meerloo, The Rape of the Mind. With today's technology, smartphones, social media, television, and the internet, never before in history has such effective means existed to manipulate the collective mind. As Marshall McLuhan warned decades ago, the medium is the message. The very tools we use to access information have become the instruments of manipulation. Breaking free from the madness. Is there a way out? Can a society infected by totalitarian madness recover? As Carl Jung suggested, those who wish to return sanity to an insane world must first bring order to their own minds. It is not for nothing that our age cries out for the Redeemer personality, for the one who can emancipate himself from the grip of the collective psychosis and save at least his own soul. Carl Jung, Civilization in Transition. To counter the lies, truth must be spread. To break the spell, the people must refuse to comply. And to resist the madness, parallel structures must be built, just as Václav Havel and the dissidents of Czechoslovakia did under Soviet rule. As Thomas Paine once said, tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Throughout history, every descent into mass psychosis and totalitarianism follows a predictable pattern. After fear is sown, after contradictions saturate the media, after menticide has dulled the critical faculties of the masses, a final psychological transformation takes place. The people learn to love their servitude. The perfect dictatorship would have the appearance of a democracy, but would be, in essence, a prison without walls. A system of slavery where, through consumption and entertainment, the slaves would love their servitude. Aldous Huxley, Brave New World Revisited. The process of submission is gradual. At first, people comply out of fear, afraid of punishment, censorship, or social exile. But over time, compliance turns into habit, and habit turns into virtue. Those who resist are branded extremists, conspiracy theorists, or threats to social harmony. This psychological shift has been documented across every totalitarian movement in history. Revolutionaries who had once fought for freedom ended up cheering for their own show trials, denouncing their own friends, and confessing to crimes they had never committed. Historian Robert Conquest described it as the ritual of submission, where the accused would stand before the court, tears streaming down their faces, professing their undying love for the system that was about to execute them. The same dynamic unfolded in Maoist China during the Cultural Revolution, where even parents turned on their own children, denouncing them as enemies of the revolution to avoid persecution themselves. The lesson: once mass psychosis takes hold, no one is safe, not even the most loyal followers of the regime. As the French philosopher Étienne de la Boétie wrote in The Politics of Obedience, a people enslaves itself, cuts its own throat, when, having a choice between being subjects or free men, it deserts its liberties and takes on the yoke. The oppressor has nothing more than the power that you give him. The true strength of totalitarianism is not in the force it exerts, but in the willingness of the people to accept their own chains. The erosion of individuality and the collective hive mind. To fully enslave a population, the ruling class must destroy the concept of individuality itself. The totalitarian system thrives not on unique, independent minds, but on the undifferentiated, obedient mass, a population that no longer sees itself as a collection of individuals, but as a single, collective entity marching toward a so-called higher goal. This is why totalitarian regimes always seek to eradicate personal identity. In Maoist China, citizens were forced to wear identical clothing, chant the same slogans, and carry Mao's Little Red Book, a symbolic gesture to erase individual distinction. In Orwell's 1984, people had numbers instead of names, and even their facial expressions were monitored to ensure complete emotional conformity. In Nazi Germany, the youth were molded into uniform ideological foot soldiers, trained not to think for themselves, but to obey without question. Hannah Arendt called this process the atomization of the individual, a psychological transformation in which people become stripped of their inner world, disconnected from their own thoughts, and reduced to mere cogs in a machine. Carl Jung, seeing the dangers of this collective madness, warned, "A group experience takes place on a lower level of consciousness than the experience of an individual. When people form a group, the darker qualities of human nature, cruelty, greed, and vengefulness, emerge in ways they never would on an individual level." This explains why under totalitarianism, ordinary people, shopkeepers, school teachers, factory workers, become agents of the regime. Why the neighbor reports the neighbor, the child denounces the parent, and the friend turns on the friend. The individual disappears, the hive mind takes over, and once a society reaches this stage, resistance becomes nearly impossible, for those who might have fought back are now part of the machine. The final stage, the cycle of collapse and rebirth. History is clear. No totalitarian regime lasts forever. While these systems of control appear monolithic and unshakable, they are in reality built on psychological sand, sustained only by lies, fear, and mass compliance. And when the weight of these contradictions becomes unbearable, the system implodes. All tyrannies rule through fraud and force, but once the fraud is exposed, they must rely exclusively on force. George Orwell. As time passes, people begin to see through the illusion. The propaganda loses its grip, the contradictions become too obvious to ignore, and the fear that once paralyzed the population begins to fade. And when fear dissolves, courage awakens. In the fall of the Berlin Wall, a population that had been indoctrinated for decades suddenly refused to comply, and within weeks, an empire collapsed. In the American Revolution, ordinary men and women, once ruled by the mightiest empire on earth, chose to fight back, sparking a movement that changed history. In the Soviet Union, decades of censorship, thought control, and economic destruction led to a point where even loyal citizens could no longer pretend, and the system crumbled under its own weight. At every moment in history, when a system of control reaches its peak, it begins to collapse under its own contradictions. And this is where we stand today. You can chain a man, you can torture a man, you can even destroy his body, but you cannot imprison his mind. Winston Churchill, the question is, will we wait for collapse, or will we reclaim our minds before it's too late? Because if history has taught us one thing, it is this: no tyranny falls unless the people refuse to kneel. If mass psychosis is the disease, then the cure is awakening, an awakening not just of the intellect, but of the spirit. Because the greatest trick of totalitarianism is not simply controlling the body, it is chaining the mind so that resistance seems impossible. But history proves one thing: no system of control is absolute, no mass psychosis is permanent, and no totalitarian regime is invincible. The question is, how do we break free? The first step is to recognize the power of the individual and the necessity of thinking for yourself. All forms of totalitarianism, whether political, social, or ideological, thrive on one thing: the fear of standing alone. The masses do not obey because they believe in the system. They obey because they are afraid to be isolated. The antidote: radical individual thought. The most courageous act is still to think for yourself, aloud. Coco Chanel. This means questioning authority when it demands blind obedience, questioning experts when they demand faith instead of evidence, and questioning the media when it tells you what to think rather than giving you facts to decide for yourself. Throughout history, one free mind has always been more powerful than a million enslaved ones, because the moment one person dares to think independently, others begin to wake up, and once a single spark of truth is lit, it spreads like wildfire. But thinking is not enough. One must also have the courage to speak the truth, even when their voice shakes. The greatest weapon of totalitarianism is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of punishment, fear of being wrong. But the only way control is maintained is when people stay silent. When freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep to the slaughter. George Washington. Throughout history, those who challenged mass psychosis, Galileo, Socrates, Orwell, Solzhenitsyn, Mandela, were ridiculed, persecuted, and even killed. But their ideas outlived their oppressors. Because truth is like a seed, it may be buried for a time, but eventually it will break through. And the moment you choose to speak, even if you are alone, you create a path for others to follow. Yet even speaking out is not enough if one is not willing to reject comfort for the sake of freedom. Modern control does not come in the form of chains, it comes in the form of comfort. Why resist when you can be entertained? Why fight for truth when lies are easier? Why challenge the system when obedience is rewarded? Because every comfort bought at the cost of truth is a step towards slavery. A society that will give up a little liberty to gain a little security will deserve neither and lose both. Benjamin Franklin. The path to freedom is uncomfortable. It requires detaching from propaganda, turning off the TV, questioning narratives, and seeking truth from multiple sources. It demands building resilience, developing skills, financial independence, and mental toughness so that your survival does not depend on a corrupt system. And it necessitates finding real community, surrounding yourself with those who value truth over comfort, courage over conformity, and freedom over obedience. The masses do not break free because they are not willing to sacrifice comfort for truth, but those who do become the ones who change history. Even still, breaking free requires something deeper, an unbreakable spirit, the conscious decision to choose freedom over submission. At its core, the battle against mass psychosis is not just political or intellectual, it is spiritual. Totalitarianism does not just seek to control your actions, it seeks to break your will, to make you believe that resistance is futile, that truth does not matter, that you are powerless. But history proves otherwise. When the world told Galileo he was wrong, he refused to recant. When millions obeyed Nazi Germany, a handful of resistance fighters chose death over submission. When Soviet oppression crushed the people, dissidents in the gulags whispered the truth in the dark. And today, when digital censorship, mass manipulation, and ideological conformity try to silence free thought, those who refuse to bow down become the new revolutionaries. Because the final truth is this: no one can take your freedom unless you surrender it. Totalitarianism only wins when you stop fighting. It only controls when you stop thinking. It only survives when you stop believing in truth. And the moment you decide, I will not be controlled, I will not be silenced, I will not live a lie, that is the moment you become truly free. Because tyranny ends the second enough people choose to stand. And the question is, will you be one of them? This is how mass psychosis is defeated, not through war, not through violence, but through awakening. One free mind, one free voice, one free soul. That is all it takes to start the unraveling. because history belongs not to the obedient, but to the courageous. And in the end, truth always wins.